Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Fitness to Influence. I am Sarah Dussault, your host, and today I'm so excited to bring you guys Kerri Axelrod. Kerri is a functional medicine dietitian, and she is going to talk to us about hormones, gut health, the connection with anxiety. If you are a perimenopausal woman or you are someone that's experiencing anxiety and curious if it's linked to your gut, you are going to want to listen to this episode. Kerri, thank you so much for joining me, and everybody, I'm excited for you to listen. Hey, Kerri, thank you so much for coming on today. I'm super excited for you to join me. We actually go way back, but I'd love for you to tell the audience about your story, how you got into functional medicine. And because we know each other from marketing, you worked for a company, I think that I did a campaign with in the early days of SarahFit, but would love to hear your journey to where you are today working with clients one-on-one in the functional medicine space.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to have this conversation, and hopefully it will be sort of really eye-opening for listeners in terms of understanding that there's likely a root cause for the symptoms that you're experiencing. So like you said, I'm a functional medicine registered dietitian. I have a private practice where I work clinically one-on-one with clients and in a group setting. I work with perimenopause clients experiencing digestive issues, anxiety, and fatigue. Like you mentioned, my life really didn't always look like this. And before I got into marketing about 13 years ago, I would say I started on a personal health journey that sort of led to a career change. And so my career actually started in presidential politics, which many people don't know. And as you can imagine, things looked very different having a career in presidential politics as they look now. And so I was always like the kid growing up that knew that they were going to work in politics, knew I was going to go to school in DC, and like wanted nothing else to do with my life. I grew up in a family in the 90s, early 2000, that was like the fitness fam, the diet family. I think I did the cabbage soup diet in high school. And so I wanted nothing to do with nutrition or fitness. It was the furthest thing from my mind at all. And so I'd say I'm really fortunate that in my 20s, my career took off at a really young age, and I ended up working my dream job in my late 20s. And I was on the presidential campaign trail, and I ended up getting really sick. And I was dealing with debilitating panic attacks, anxiety, fatigue, dizziness, digestive issues, you sort of name it. And as many of the clients that I work with, and I'm sure your listeners can relate to, and maybe you can relate as well, as like we start to normalize our symptoms, and we start to think that they're just kind of common and we live with them. This is kind of how far I was from health at that time, is that in my head I was like, everyone's really dizzy after they go through a really stressful event, or a time with work, or like everyone needs a day or two when they can't get out of bed. Obviously, that's not necessarily the case, but that's where I was at that time. And the dizziness, the chronic fatigue, the anxiety, and the panic attacks were really disruptive to my life. And so I started going to the doctor. And I really went from doctor to doctor at that time. And really the only solutions that I was given was medication. And I would take a medication for a little bit of time. It wouldn't really work. I wasn't really happy with the result, and I would go back and I was given another medication. And I'm certainly not anti-medication, but when something's not working in my gut, I was like, there's got to be something else contributing to why I don't feel well, why I'm experiencing these symptoms. And again, I knew nothing about health. I knew nothing about functional medicine at this time, but I just had this gut feeling. And when I was going to the doctors, no one was asking me how I was eating at that time, which was mostly takeout because I didn't have any time to cook. No one was asking me how I was sleeping, which was with my laptop in my bed and my phone underneath my pillow. No one was asking me, am I taking any time off from work? Do I have any hobbies? The answer was like, absolutely not. I'm working 7 days a week. And so this was back in 2012. And in 2013, the first training I did was actually just so I could kind of heal myself and get back to my life. And spoiler alert, I never went back to politics. And, 13 years later, with lots of education and trainings, I now, run a private practice in the functional medicine space.
So initially, when clients are seeking you out, what are the top reasons that people are looking for you? Because I think a lot of people probably have already seen their general practitioner and they're not getting the results there. So then people find you. What are they seeking you out for? What's missing from their regular doctor?
Yeah. Well, first, I always say, like, great. That's fabulous if you've already gone to your PCP, you've got some labs, and they say everything is normal. But that means I don't need to refer you back there to rule out anything kind of major beyond the scope of what I would do. So some people think it's like frustrating. And, I see that as like a green flag. That's great. I work with a couple of different clients. I mentioned I have a group program. And so in that group program, I'm mostly working with clients who are experiencing ongoing constipation, fatigue, bloating, and anxiety. So we really work on rebalancing the gut and the gut-brain connection in that program. And then in my one-on-one practice, I'm mostly working with women experiencing perimenopause symptoms. And so that can also be gut, anxiety, fatigue, pre-period mood swings, cramping, irregular periods, kind of all of the things that unfortunately are pretty common in perimenopause stages.
I usually refer to my clients, I'm like, first thing, I'm like, go get your labs done. Let's see what's going on. And almost all of them come back and their doctors are like, they say they're normal. And I'm like, they're technically normal, but they're not necessarily optimal. But then another test that has come on my radar, and it's something you work with, you recommend is, testing for the gut. Now, I know how it is, but I want you to tell our readers, how do we test the gut?
Yeah.
And what does it tell us?
Yeah. Testing the stool, testing your gut, your poop is one of the most important kind of foundational steps that you can do, whether you're experiencing digestive issues, especially if you're experiencing digestive issues. And when I say digestive issues, I mean, constipation, loose stools, bloating, gas, etc. And then it's also one of the most important things that you can do if you're experiencing fluctuations in mood, hormones, etc., because they're all kind of linked together. And so I think a stool test is actually one of the most foundational labs that you can do. And it's a little bit intimidating at first, but it doesn't take that long. We're literally testing your poop. So you're pooping into a little bit of a container, and it gets sent to the lab. And from there, it gives us a really good insight into are there any underlying infections in the gut that could be contributing to your symptoms? What do your beneficial bacteria look like that are really important, especially as you enter into perimenopause, and especially our beneficial bacteria can really take a hit as estrogen begins to decline. It looks at if there are any imbalances with bacteria that we don't want to see overgrown that can be contributing to GI symptoms. It looks at any infections, your overall digestive health. So there's so many important health markers that we can get from, the right stool test.
I have a lot of clients that come to me and they're like, I'm still bloated. I'm eating all the right foods.
Yeah.
Why am I so uncomfortable? And so, I recently referred to someone through just an online program. I've worked with Tiny Health a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, you can send this in and get, some results, get some feedback. So when you look at those results, what tend to be the biggest red flags, or what is the most common red flag that you see with a client who's experiencing things like anxiety or weight loss resistance and bloating?
Yeah. So the bloating piece I typically see when there's a lot of bacteria overgrown that we don't necessarily want to see overgrown. And that can actually happen when you're consuming probiotic foods or fiber, which are really important. But when you're putting them into an unhealthy gut, they can actually contribute to and exacerbate a lot of symptoms. So sometimes we actually have to correct anything that's imbalanced in the gut before you can actually tolerate a lot of fiber and probiotics.
How do you do that with clients?
It depends on what we see, which is I'm a big fan of testing before just introducing supplementation. Because if you've got a lot of healthy bacteria that is low, we can't really go in there first and hammer the bacteria that's overgrown that might be contributing to your symptoms, because your beneficial bacteria becomes collateral damage. So sometimes we actually have to build up that beneficial bacteria before we can go after the bacteria that's contributing to your symptoms. So it's going to be really kind of case dependent, symptom dependent, what we're seeing in the labs in terms of the approach that we're going to take to alleviate symptoms and rebalance the gut.
When it comes to rebalancing the gut, exactly maybe it just shows my lack of knowledge in this area. And so how do we rebalance it? Are we doing an elimination diet?
Yeah.
Is it strictly supplementation and we add specific supplements? And again, every client is different.
Yeah.
I strongly believe that everyone is different. Everybody is different. Everybody's going to respond differently. But typically, if someone does have an overgrowth of bad bacteria, what are they recommended they start to do?
Yeah, I always say there's really kind of two steps to the process. So first, identify what the problem is. And so first, we've got to identify the problem via your lab testing and a deep assessment, because labs are just numbers on a page unless we're putting the numbers to the human being that's experiencing the symptoms. So labs and a really deep assessment to kind of understand what's actually driving the problem. And then once we understand what's driving the problem, then there becomes this clear roadmap to eliminate the symptom. And so what does that roadmap entail, which will look slightly different? It's nutrition, it's blood sugar balancing, it's short-term targeted supplementation that address the lab markers that are out of balance, it's mineral repletion, and it's nervous system support. And really kind of once we have those sort of 5 things or so in place based on the assessment and lab data, that's really where clients can see symptoms be eliminated that they've been struggling with for years and years and years.
Is that protocol kind of a blanket to help alleviate anxiety as well? It's kind of like, all of these things, like at least for the faster way, it's like you want to lose weight. All of these things are going to help you get there, whether you have, insulin resistance or you have hypothyroidism. It's kind of the same roadmap. And when it comes to balancing the gut, where is it individualized? Is it the specific supplementation, or is it kind of like the program should work for most people? And, at least with the faster way, if it doesn't, we go in and we're like, okay, now let's dive even deeper. But you've already got those stool samples, so you're able to dive a little bit of deeper. What are the little bit of the differences between the testing that you kind of take with the clients, or is it kind of like it fits most people? It will benefit most people.
I think a stool test will benefit most people, regardless if you have digestive issues. Certainly, if you're experiencing gut issues ongoing, like I always say, don't pass go and collect $200. Like that's what you're doing first is a stool test. But when it comes to hormones, anxiety, etc., there are other labs that we would want to look at in addition to a stool test as well. And so the labs that I use are really determined based on the person, the stage of life, and the symptoms that they're experiencing. So, for example, if I'm looking at anxiety, I also want to know what estrogen and progesterone look like. I want to know what your adrenals look like. I want to know what vitamin D, iron, thyroid, B12, kind of all of those things that can also be contributing to anxiety. And from those labs, we'll get a really clear picture on what your nutrition needs to look like. What are the supplements that you need? What are the lifestyle changes that are really going to make the biggest bang for the buck? But everyone needs to work on blood sugar balance. Everyone needs to work on adrenal support. Everyone needs to work on minerals. 90% of women need to be lifting heavier weights, et cetera. All the things that you kind of talk about. But, I'm here to really help the person get a little bit more specific in terms of, what are the health markers that they really need to improve on.
My favorite supplements right now, I love creatine. I take that regularly. I'm also a huge magnesium person. I'm also obsessed with ashwagandha. I do a probiotic almost every day. Sometimes I'll do a multivitamin, but I always do vitamin D with K3. What are some of your favorite supplements that you take and ones that you recommend to your clients?
I think it's interesting because with supplements, it's like one person's, what's right for one person is like literally kryptonite for another person. And so I think that that's the benefit, especially if you're doing some of the foundational supplements that you've talked about, which are generally really beneficial for people. And then you're taking them and you're reacting really poorly. Then that tells us that something's going on under the hood, and you could really benefit from working with someone like me. I'm a huge fan of magnesium, especially magnesium bisglycinate. But I also have a lot of clients that really react poorly to magnesium because they've got histamine imbalances. I think a probiotic is really important for the general healthy population. But if you're struggling with a lot of digestive issues, then a probiotic could actually exacerbate your issues. And so, for the general person that doesn't have a lot of symptoms going on, I think, those supplements can be great. But if you've tried them and you're reacting poorly, that's really, another kind of clue. We've got to really do some labs to understand what's specific and targeted. I do like a lot of adrenal cocktails. mineral repletion, et cetera, can be really beneficial for people too, in addition to what you talk about.
I know a few of the faster way coaches, they talk about adrenal cocktails. Can you tell me specifically what is an adrenal cocktail and at what point in the day are people taking this?
An adrenal cocktail is really just kind of a fancy way of making a mocktail that is designed to support the adrenals. So your adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys and they produce stress hormones, most predominantly cortisol. And I'll talk about the adrenal cocktail, but I also feel like I'll be remiss to say this, is that on social media, I feel like cortisol is being demonized. And cortisol is like, there's high cortisol, oh, right? And I look at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cortisol labs and adrenal labs. And I will say 1 out of maybe 20 to 25 labs that I look at comes back as high cortisol. Most women I work with have extremely low depleted cortisol. And I think that that is a function of takes us a really, really long time to seek the help that we need because we normalize symptoms. And I've certainly been there myself. So I'm saying we and not, kind of pointing any fingers here. And then we've got a society that just tells us that it's normal and suck it up and deal with it. And we've kind of internalized those messages. And so I will say that taking a supplement for high cortisol when your cortisol is low can put you in a hole that's very, very, very tough to get out of. And so I am very cautious about, I think adaptogens are a little bit of a different story and they work, in sync with your body and what's going on. But, supplements that are specifically designed to bring down cortisol, I wouldn't recommend unless we've got some labs to kind of prove that you've actually need that. So back to the adrenal cocktail conversation. Usually an adrenal cocktail is some combination of sodium, potassium, vitamin C, and then some people will add magnesium to it. And looking at a ratio that will really help the adrenals begin to kind of function more optimally. Your adrenals really are a sodium-dependent process, and then you've got the sodium-potassium pump that allows sodium and potassium to get in and out of the cells. Your adrenals are one of the places in the body that uses the highest level of vitamin C. And then you can kind of throw in some magnesium too for a little bit of nervous system support. So it's some combination of those vitamins and minerals.
That's kind of where like a little bit of my limit of expertise comes in. It's like, I know fat loss, but once we start to get a little bit deeper, and I have a dietitian on staff who is going to start to do blood work labs with some of my clients. But I always tell clients, I'm like, once we get into this little bit of nitty gritty, this is a little bit beyond my scope of practice, but I am the ultimate student and I love learning. And that was one of the reasons why I was like, we've got to have Kerri on to talk about some of this stuff. So switching gears just a little bit, you mentioned nervous system support. I'm assuming this has to do with a lot of like maybe meditation, yoga, sleep, rest. Tell me a little bit more about what that means to you and what you're recommending to your clients.
Most of us are in this chronic state of fight or flight. When we're in this chronic state of fight or flight, we actually physiologically shut down the digestive process. And so blood flow moves away from our gut, our digestion, and moves to our extremities, because I always say that we are in a biological mismatch and that our body still thinks that we are on the Serengeti plane. And so it's not distinguishing between the email that you got that pisses you off, that's really stressful, and we all get those emails, right? And running from a saber-toothed tiger. Your body doesn't actually distinguish between those. And so what can happen is that in the nervous system, we can kind of get stuck in this loop where we'll get a trigger. Our body sounds the alarm that we need to run for safety, that this is a huge stressful event. Digestion gets shut off. We've got our stress hormones that are cranking out. A lot of times the adrenal glands are burnt out. They can't even take on that sort of extra stress. And we're wondering why, the littlest bit of stress wipes us out at the end of the day, that like we can't even function sort of after that. And so I think that that's really where nervous system support can come in. And depending on the client and the type of symptoms that they're dealing with, that can be everything from neuroplasticity work, and I can talk about, sort of what that means, to things like you mentioned, yoga, meditation, even kind of simple breathwork practices that really take us out of that fight or flight response and into the parasympathetic nervous system response.
This is something too I just filmed. I think it's coming out tomorrow. My top wellness trends that I think are going to be big in 2025. And one of them is kind of like the whole idea of breath work, of yoga, of,
Love that.
meditation and walking, getting away from, the high stress, high anxiety, not high anxiety, high stress type like workouts,
Yeah.
kind of, taking things down. And I know when I was in my 20s, I was on a mission to burn as many calories as I could. That was like, it didn't matter. Like the workouts, I just wanted to burn as many calories as I could. And it's funny, I looked back at old labs and I was told that it was totally normal. And I was looking at a thyroid lab and one of them was at like over a 3. I think it was my T3. I forget. But something was high and it was like borderline high normal. But looking back, I'm like, that was when I was working at Barry's boot camp. So you could bet I was taking a couple classes a week. I was training for a marathon and I hadn't discovered the faster way. So I was definitely thinking that like I was supposed to be eating 1,400 calories and carbs were bad. No one had ever said rest, stop running on empty and going to extremes and thinking that everything has to be like the hardest workout of your life. And really what my body needed was rest. And I didn't actually achieve that until I got pregnant with Tommy. And that forced me to slow down. And I credit my first pregnancy really with changing my health because ultimately it was the introduction of more food. It was eliminating a lot of processed foods because I just wanted what was best for my son in utero. And then just like rest. I didn't realize it was nervous. Maybe it was nervous system support. Maybe it wasn't. But I really think that kind of completely changed everything for me. And, maybe this is something that you can talk about too, is that everybody's talking about balancing hormones. That's a hot topic on Instagram, right? Balancing hormones. Nobody's talking about exactly what hormones they're referring to. For me as a health professional, I think most of them are talking about estrogen and progesterone. But then the ones that I also like to mention is like ghrelin and leptin.
Yeah.
The hunger and fullness hormones. For me, at least, before Tommy, never knew when I was hungry. I was hungry all the time. Like people talk about Ozempic and stuff, calming food noise. And I'm like, I had so much food noise back then. All I thought about was food. I didn't know when I was hungry. I didn't know when I was full. When clients come to you and they're like, my hormones are imbalanced, or maybe you do blood work and you notice there is an imbalance. What is it that you're looking for? What are kind of the few steps that you take with them to rectify that?
I mean, I think there's a lot to kind of what you just
There was
said.
a big
too.
art.
I think that's great. I think, I could probably imagine what was elevated was TSH for you. And there's certainly a connection between, stress, the adrenal glands, and thyroid dysfunction and, really subclinical thyroid dysfunction. We could do a whole podcast episode on that in terms of the number of women that are unfortunately walking around with subclinical hypothyroidism. That isn't enough to say like you need thyroid medication, but is certainly contributing to weight gain, fatigue, brain fog, etc. So I think you kind of nailed it there in the connection between stress, the adrenals, and sort of thyroid. But when we're talking about balancing hormones, I think it is a little bit of a misnomer. And I think that misnomer is then used to discredit women that are experiencing real symptoms. To me, it doesn't matter what it's called, right? It's like we're experiencing these real symptoms and there's something that you can do about it. But I think generally when the term balancing hormones is thrown out on social media, we're thinking about estrogen and progesterone, ovarian hormones. For sure. I would say for most like healthy cycling women in their 20s and 30s, estrogen and progesterone are very rhythmic. They have this natural pattern that they follow. And in perimenopause specifically, that pattern can kind of go haywire. And that's certainly, what can be contributing to some of the symptoms. So some of the labs that I want to see is, what's going on with estrogen and what's going on with progesterone, certainly. And then kind of taking the appropriate steps to kind of help smooth out the fluctuations if that's needed.
There's a big anxiety connection with perimenopause, but also, you mentioned you work with 2 kind of separate sets of clients. And before we started recording, I was like, I feel like those are kind of, a similar, they have a lot that are in common. It's like with perimenopause, one of my biggest symptoms was anxiety. All of a sudden I had raging anxiety. And I know you talk a lot about the connection between anxiety and the gut.
Yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit more about anxiety and what we can do to manage it in perimenopause? Because again, not to talk about what we just spoke about, but it's like, you said there's this natural dance with estrogen and progesterone, but then when we're in perimenopause, they kind of go out of whack. They're
Yeah.
they're a little bit more random, and that's kind of why we experience some of this. But that's natural. Like it's going to happen until we hit menopause. So what are you doing with your clients to try to manage that? Because there does feel like there's so much that's out of our control.
Some of the symptoms, obviously perimenopause and into menopause is a natural transition. We're all going to go through it, right? But I think that a lot of times the symptoms are really exacerbated based on the state of health we are in before we enter perimenopause and then menopause. And so while perimenopause and menopause are natural transitions, I would say the extent of the symptoms that a lot of women are experiencing are exacerbated based on the state of health the underlying state of health that many of us are in before we really enter into perimenopause. And I certainly went through this horrific, 2024 with my own health and a Lyme diagnosis and kind of what that did to my adrenal glands and then hormones. And so I'm certainly not, again, pointing the finger. I know what that's like in my own body too. I'll talk about the gut too, but from an estrogen and progesterone standpoint, there's a couple of things that we can actually do to kind of ease that transition and buffer those symptoms. Certainly supplements can be really helpful, and it would really depend on what your labs show and what you need. For example, maca, if estrogen is pretty low, sometimes maca can really help with some of that estrogen production. And then to support progesterone, sometimes we would want to look at B6, vitamin E, something called chase tree that can support ovulation. So depending on what you need, there are some supplements that can kind of support that hormonal transition. And then I know we haven't talked about this yet, but I'm actually a big fan of HRT and, HRT for the appropriate person at the appropriate time. So that can be really beneficial from the hormone standpoint. And then anxiety standpoint, I really look at something called short chain fatty acids. And I feel like short chain fatty acids in the gut, I'm really kind of like showing my nerdiness at this point, but they really don't get the recognition that they deserve. And that, there's a lot of, most of our neurotransmitters are produced in the gut, et cetera. I would say the research literature on that is really inconclusive of whether those neurotransmitters cross the blood-brain barrier. But there's something called short chain fatty acids that are produced in our gut, and our gut bacteria makes them by fermenting on the fiber that we eat. It has been shown that these short chain fatty acids can cross the blood-brain barrier, and they help modulate inflammation in the brain and neurotransmitters. And so making sure you've got the bacteria in your gut that helps produce these short chain fatty acids can be really, really important for the overall piece of the gut-brain connection. And that's something certainly we'll look at, and, I'll look at on the stool test.
What do you recommend people eat for that? Like, is that again, like supplement or specific foods? Or?
Yeah, so it can be really specific foods. So things like red polyphenols can be really beneficial for certain short chain fatty acid producers in the gut. And when I say red polyphenols, it's nothing more complicated than like eat foods that are naturally red in color. So that's strawberries, cherries, tomatoes. I'm sure I'm forgetting
raspberries.
a million of them.
Yeah,
exactly. We don't have to overcomplicate it. And everyone's like, well, how much? It's one better than the other. And I always say choose the foods that you're actually going to consume, that you enjoy, and consume 1 to 2 servings of them, a day. And I think that that's great. And then depending on the short chain fatty acids, and this is where labs can get really beneficial in that certain bacteria in the gut are selective on the fibers that they'll utilize. And so things like akasha fiber or inulin can be really helpful, but it would sort of really depend on the bacteria that needs supported.
I love testing. Do you ever get a client and you're like, you don't need to be tested? Like, I sometimes get clients who want to lose weight, and I'm like, I don't know if we need to lose weight.
Yeah.
If you want to do my program and build strength, let's do it. But let's have some realistic goals. Do you ever have clients that are searching for a problem and it doesn't exist?
Yeah. I mean, and I think that that's why it goes back to also the fundamentals. That's really important. And that no lab or supplement is going to correct missing fundamentals. And I think that that's also really important because there are so many practitioners out there that will run labs, prescribe supplements and recommend an elimination diet. And I've had clients be stuck in that cycle for years and years and years and years and wonder why they don't get better. And I said, if it was that easy, like you would have gotten better 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so I think to your point, it's like none of this stuff works unless we're also working on, what are the most important fundamentals of health.
I'll have clients and they'll be like, I'm not seeing any progress. And I'll go in and I can actually look at what my clients eat now. And I'm
Yeah.
like, you had so much processed food and I don't see any fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
Eat the rainbow. So many ailments can be cured by just eating real unprocessed foods,
Yeah.
a variety of them. And people don't want to do the work. They want the easiest route possible. And it's like, there's going to be all these other issues that come up. This is kind of a random one.
Yeah.
Have you worked with any clients on the weight loss drugs?
Yes. So I
What are you
trained.
seeing from your end?
Yeah.
Because I'm not against them, but
No.
I haven't looked at labs of anybody.
Yeah. So I trained at a very popular functional medicine center, and there were lots and lots of clients on weight loss drugs. And first, I will say that like it is not for me to determine like what is appropriate for you in your life. There are numerous reasons why peptides could be beneficial. I will say that I think the problem where we get, I'm just trying to like kind of think about my words here. I think the problem where we get into with peptides and certain weight loss drugs or, one type of a peptide is that like anything in our health culture is that we take it to the extreme. Macro dosing a peptide without making the necessary lifestyle changes, the necessary nutrition changes, the necessary strength training changes, all of like the great things that you talk about as well. It's like you're kind of just setting yourself up for, a not a great outcome if you ever want to get off the peptides. And so I've certainly seen a lot more success with them on like a lack of better terminology, more of a microdosing level, which kind of quiets some of the food noise while, you're strength training, while you're eating a mostly whole foods, unprocessed diet, while you're supporting your circadian rhythm, while you also learning like the blood sugar regulation, kind of all of those things. So like anything, I think they can be a tool when used appropriately, but without some of the foundations of health like we're talking about, I haven't really necessarily seen the long-term outcomes that people are looking for.
Yeah, I was curious if you had looked at any like of the stool analysis, if there was anything like red flags, because I haven't seen. I mean, to me, the where I would jump in is I'm usually like, if you ever want to go off these, come learn about macros, learn about how much food you need. We don't want you to be like living on 800 calories and all of a sudden you want to go off and you're like, oh, wait, like I can't sustain it. Like it's just not,
Yeah.
not going to happen. You've lost all your muscle. I was curious if you had seen any labs. If you haven't,
I mean, I don't know that we have like, I don't know that they've been popularized enough yet to like kind of look at like the stool data to see like what
Yeah.
changes in the microbiome. But like we can theorize that if you're eating 800 calories a day and that you're not getting adequate amounts of fiber or rich polyphenols that we've talked about, like your gut bacteria is going to take a massive hit. And then, some of the GI symptoms that we're experiencing with the peptide are only going to be exacerbated. And then, I have certainly seen labs where like the short-term effects of, due to their like the mechanisms of which they act on with insulin, better blood sugar labs, but those are only going to be short-term unless you're also working on the nutritional changes that are actually required for better blood sugar and sort of insulin regulation.
Yeah. Well, this has been super interesting to me. Is there anything that I missed that I didn't cover that you think that the woman who's listening to this right now needs to know?
Yeah. I think the only thing that I will share is what's always served me in my own health is if something doesn't feel right and the answers that you're getting don't feel right for you, then don't stop. Like listen to your gut, because if I never listened to my gut 13 years ago, who knows, sort of where I would be. And unfortunately, I work with way too many women who have been trying to advocate for themselves for years and years and years and not really gotten anywhere, unfortunately, and sort of our traditional medical system. And so if you feel like you're not getting the answers that you need and you're not getting better, that there are other answers out there for you and you've just got to sort of seek that care.
And I know I have a lot of clients that are always like, where, like, do you have a functional medicine, doctor, dietitian that you recommend? You obviously work with clients virtually. If
Hmm.
someone did want to see someone, and we'll put your information in the show notes so people
Yeah.
can contact you, reach out to you, your Instagram. Is there a database, like if someone wanted to see someone in person, like locally, is there like a specific place that you recommend to find someone that isn't just selling snake oil because we all are overwhelmed
Yeah.
with, the amount of resources we have?
Yeah, and I think it is important to be discerning in the functional medicine space too. I think the best place to do is like get recommendations from family, from friends, from, other people. I think, especially the great thing about social media is people are actually sharing their experience. And that's one of the best ways that you can really, make sure that you're working with someone that is actually knowledgeable, that didn't just go through a 6-month coaching certification and then all of a sudden can like read your labs. And so I would say that like talking to people in your life is probably one of the best ways to really get that good sort of recommendation. And then Google reviews. I can't tell you how many clients I've gotten just based on the Google reviews that they've read from past clients. And I think that that's probably a really great way to kind of start to sift through who's legitimate and who's not.
And you have over 16,000 Instagram followers, which is amazing. And whoever's listening, like that's a lot, but there are people that obviously have 100, 200,000 millions. The number of followers does not mean someone is a better doctor, dietitian, because a lot of times, at least, in all practices, they're just tend to be the best marketers. Like that's no, and you're not doing marketing anymore.
No.
You're teaching people how to heal their bodies. And so, I think a lot of times people sometimes will go on and they'll be like, well, this person has the most followers. And it's like, well, that means that they're awesome at marketing. They're really great at
Yeah.
social media. That doesn't necessarily mean they're great at getting people results. This is coming from someone who has, 100,000 followers, but Kerri knows her stuff. So, Kerri, where can people find you on Instagram and your website?
Instagram, my name is at Kerri Axelrod, KerriAxelrod. My website is the same, kerriaxelrod.com. If you go to my website, you're interested in working with me one-on-one or in my group, there is a link right on the homepage and you can set up a totally free call and fill out my application. We can chat about if working with me one-on-one or my group program is the right fit for you. I do labs in both programs. And then I also have a free quiz if anyone is interested in taking it. That's just
Yeah.
www.kerriaxelrod.com/quiz. And that helps you determine what is the main root cause of your health symptoms so you know really where to focus on first.
I love that because I get clients and I'm always like, it's always the clients that are doing all the things and they're just not seeing results. And it's like, I used to always be blood. And now I'm like, oh, wait, now we might need to go more stool. So that was why I was so excited when I was like, we need to have Kerri on. So thank you so much for joining me. And thank you to everybody for listening. Please subscribe, leave a review, and let us know on Instagram what you guys thought of today's episode. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.